They came with torches and rope at midnight, ready to burn Kate Chambers alive in her own cabin for the crime of showing mercy to a starving Apache warrior. But none of them expected the shadow that stepped from the tree line with eyes like winter, lightning and a Winchester that never missed its mark. The smoke still curled from the chimney of Kate Chambers' cabin when Sheriff Tom Bradley and his men surrounded the small log structure nestled in the cottonwoods along Willow Creek. The September air carried the scent of burning pine and something else, something that made the horses skittish and the men gripped their rifles tighter against their chests. It was the smell of fear, thick and acrid, mixing with the wood smoke to create an atmosphere that seemed to press down on the small clearing like a coming storm. Kate stood in her doorway, flour still dusting her apron from the morning's bread, watching 23 armed men arrange themselves in a semicircle around her home. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature grey from 2 years of frontier hardship, caught the morning light as she tilted her chin up, in that way her late husband Samuel had always called stubborn as a Missouri mule. Behind her, through the half-open door, came the soft sound of laboured breathing. The Apache warrior she'd found collapsed by her well 3 days ago, burning with fever and half dead from a cavalry sabre wound that had festered green and angry. "Kate Chambers," Sheriff Bradley called out, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd rather be anywhere else in the territory, but found himself backed into a corner by the fury of the townspeople behind him. "You know why we're here. Come out peaceable, and we'll make this quick and clean. No need for you to suffer overmuch for what you've done." What she'd done was simple enough to understand, though apparently impossible for the good Christian folks of Mesquite Flats to forgive. She'd found a dying man, enemy or not, and she'd done what any decent person with half a soul would do. She'd cleaned his wounds, fed him broth when he could keep it down, and sat by his side through 2 nights of fever dreams where he'd called out names in Apache that sounded like prayers or curses or both. It hadn't mattered to her that his skin was copper brown, or that his long black hair was braided with feathers and beads that caught the lamplight like captured stars. A dying man was a dying man, and Kate Chambers had never been one to let suffering continue when she had the power to ease it. "I'm not coming anywhere with you, Tom Bradley," Kate replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands that she kept hidden in the folds of her worn calico dress. "And I'm not apologizing for doing what any Christian woman with an ounce of compassion would do when she finds another human being bleeding to death on her property. If that makes me a traitor to your way of thinking, then I suppose I'll wear that label with more pride than I ever wore a wedding ring." The crowd behind the sheriff stirred like a nest of disturbed hornets. Kate could see familiar faces among them. Men who'd bought supplies from her little trading post, women who'd asked her advice on treating their children's fevers, neighbors who'd helped her bury Samuel just 2 winters past when the consumption finally took him. Now they looked at her with eyes that held no recognition of shared humanity, only the cold fire of a righteous anger that had been stoked by 3 days of saloon talk and pulpit preaching about the savage menace that threatened their way of life. "Damn it, Kate," called out Marcus Webb, the blacksmith whose own son she'd helped birth during a blizzard that had trapped them all for 3 days the previous winter. His face was flushed red above his thick brown beard, and his massive hands clenched and unclenched around the handle of a torch that seemed pitifully small in his grip. "You can't just harbor an Apache warrior like he's some lost puppy. These savages killed the Morrison family just last month, scalped them all, including the baby. How can you look us in the eye and tell us we're wrong for wanting justice?" Kate's jaw tightened as she remembered little Jenny Morrison, barely 3 years old, who used to come to the trading post with her mother to buy penny candy and always left sticky fingerprints on the glass jars. The Apache raids had been getting worse all summer as the cavalry pushed deeper into traditional hunting grounds, driving the tribes to desperation and fury. But the man lying half-conscious in her cabin bore scars that told a different story. Old wounds from battles fought years ago, calluses on his hands that spoke of work with horses and leather rather than scalping knives, and most tellingly, a small silver cross hanging on a leather cord around his neck that suggested someone, somewhere, had tried to build bridges instead of burning them. The Morrison murders were terrible, Marcus, and my heart breaks for that family, Kate said, stepping fully into the doorway now so that her slight frame filled the opening like a challenge thrown down between the armed men and the wounded Apache behind her. But this man didn't kill them any more than you killed the Apache children that died when Captain Harrison's men burned out that winter camp last December. We're all paying for sins we didn't commit, and we're all letting hatred make us into people we never thought we'd become. A voice from the back of the crowd, sharp and female, cut through the morning air like a blade. Pretty words from a woman who's forgotten which side she's supposed to be on. It was Martha Henley, the banker's wife, her narrow face pinched with the kind of moral certainty that Kate had learned to fear more than any Apache war cry. Maybe losing your husband addled your brain, Kate Chambers, but the rest of us still remember who the enemy is. That savage in your cabin would slit your throat while you slept if he had the strength, and you're fool enough to spoon-feed him like a baby. The insult about Samuel hit Kate like a physical blow, and for a moment, the careful control she'd maintained slipped enough to show the raw grief that still lived just beneath her composed exterior. Samuel had been everything good about civilization, a doctor who'd treated anyone who needed help, regardless of their ability to pay, a man who'd read poetry aloud by the fire and taught her to see beauty in the harsh landscape of the New Mexico territory. He'd also been the one to treat Apache and Mexican and white patients with equal care, a philosophy that had earned him respect from unexpected quarters, but had also made their little homestead a target for criticism from the more narrow-minded residents of Mesquite Flats. Samuel would have done exactly what I'm doing, Kate said quietly, but her voice carried across the clearing with perfect clarity. He would have treated that man's wounds and fed him and sat with him until he was strong enough to decide his own fate. And if that makes us both traitors to your cause, then I'm proud to be a traitor to hatred, and proud to be an enemy of the kind of Christianity that puts skin color above human decency. Sheriff Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his weathered face showing the strain of a man caught between duty and conscience. He'd known Kate and Samuel for 5 years, had seen them help anyone who needed it without asking questions about politics or race. But he'd also seen what Apache raiders could do to isolated homesteads, and the pressure from the territorial government to take a hard line against anyone who aided hostile Indians was becoming impossible to ignore. The recent increase in raids had the whole territory on edge, and public opinion was swinging towards solutions that involved bullets rather than negotiations. "Kate, you know I don't want to do this," Bradley said, his voice dropping to a tone that might have been pleading. If sheriffs were allowed to plead with suspected Indian sympathizers. But that Apache in your cabin, he's not just any warrior. He's wearing war paint and carrying weapons. And word is, he's one of Victorio's raiders who've been hitting supply trains all summer. The territorial governor himself sent word that anyone harboring hostile Indians is to be treated as an enemy. A combatant. My hands are tied here. Kate felt her heart skip a beat at the mention of Victorio, the Apache leader whose name had become synonymous with lightning-fast raids and vanishing acts that left the cavalry chasing shadows across the desert. If the man in her cabin truly was one of Victorio's warriors, then her act of mercy had just become an act of treason in the eyes of the law. But when she thought of the way he'd looked at her when consciousness returned, not with the cold calculation of a killer, but with the surprised gratitude of a man who'd expected to die alone and unmourned, she found she didn't care what laws she might be breaking. Then your hands are tied by men who've never seen what a bullet wound looks like when it's festering with infection, Kate replied. her voice gaining strength as her anger began to override her fear. They're tied by politicians who make their decisions from comfortable offices in Santa Fe, while real people out here die from hatred and stupidity and the absolute inability to see that Apache mothers love their children just as much as white mothers do. If that makes me an enemy combatant, Tom Bradley, then you'd better be prepared to shoot an unarmed woman in her own doorway, because I'm not moving. The standoff stretched out like a held breath. 23 armed men facing one woman who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. The Apache warrior behind her had fallen silent, either unconscious again or listening with the acute awareness of a predator who knows he's been cornered. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that made the men's faces look gaunt and dangerous, while somewhere in the distance a red-tailed hawk circled on thermals that lifted off the warming earth like prayers made visible. That's when Marcus Webb stepped forward, his torch raised high enough to cast flickering orange light across his bearded face. "We didn't come here to debate philosophy with a woman who's lost her mind," he said, his voice thick with the kind of righteousness that Kate had learned to recognize as the most dangerous force on the frontier. "We came here to remove a threat to our families and our way of life. If she won't come out, then we burn the cabin with both of them inside. At least then we know the threat is ended." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Kate saw several men check their weapons, while others moved to surround the cabin completely. The smell of kerosene reached her nose as someone began dousing the dry logs that formed the foundation of her home, and she realized with crystalline clarity that these men, her neighbors, her customers, people she'd shared meals with and mourned alongside, were actually going to burn her alive for the crime of showing mercy to an enemy they'd never tried to understand. "Wait," she called out, raising her hand in a gesture that stopped the men in their tracks, more from surprise than respect. "If you're going to murder me for doing what I thought was right, then at least let me have my say first. Let me tell you what I learned from 3 days of sitting with your Apache boogeyman, listening to him call out for someone named Maria in perfectly good Spanish, watching him clutch that silver cross around his neck like it was the only thing, keeping him anchored to this world." She paused, letting her words sink in while she gathered the courage for what might be her final speech. The men had stopped moving, but their weapons remained ready, and she could see the uncertainty in some faces warring with the bloodlust in others. If she was going to die today, she was determined to plant seeds of doubt that might grow into something better than the hatred that had brought them to her door. "His name is Joaquin," Kate continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the truth that no one wanted to hear. "He told me that much when the fever broke on the second night. He's not one of Victorio's raiders. He's a scout for the cavalry. Been working with Captain Morrison for 2 years now, trying to track down the real war parties that have been hitting the supply trains. He was coming here to warn us about a planned attack on Mesquite Flats when some of your trigger-happy friends shot him off his horse and left him for dead. The man you want to burn alive was coming to save your lives." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackle of torches and the distant call of that circling hawk. Kate could see the doubt spreading across faces like ripples in a pond, but she could also see the anger hardening in others who were too invested in their hatred to accept any truth that might complicate their worldview. Marcus Webb's face had gone pale above his beard, but his grip on the torch never wavered. "You're lying," Martha Henley's voice cut across the clearing like a whip crack. "Apache don't work with the cavalry, they don't speak Spanish, and they sure as hell don't wear Christian crosses. You've been alone too long, Kate Chambers, and grief has made you as crazy as a loon in winter. That savage has probably been feeding you stories while he planned how best to kill you once he got his strength back." Kate felt the last of her patience snap like an overstressed rope. "Then come see for yourself," she said, stepping aside from the doorway and gesturing toward the dim interior of her cabin. "Come see the letters he carries from Captain Morrison. written in Spanish and English, recommending him for a citation for bravery. Come see the scars on his back from Apache arrows shot by his own people because they consider him a traitor for working with whites. Come see a man who's been caught between two worlds and found a home in neither, just like every other soul trying to survive on this God-forsaken frontier. But even as she spoke the words, Kate could see that truth was not going to be enough. The crowd had come expecting to find a simple story. Good versus evil, us versus them, civilization versus savagery. They weren't prepared to deal with complexity, with the possibility that the world might be more nuanced than their fears had painted it. The torches were still burning, the kerosene had already been poured, and 23 armed men had too much invested in their version of justice to back down now. That's when the shot rang out. The shot had come from the ridge above Kate's cabin, and in the stunned silence that followed, every man in the clearing found himself looking up at a figure that seemed carved from shadow and morning mist. He stood motionless as stone on the rocky outcrop, a Winchester rifle still smoking. In his hands, the morning sun creating a silhouette that looked more like a force of nature than a man. None of them had heard him approach, none had seen him climb the ridge, yet there he was, patient as death and twice as certain. Sheriff Bradley was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Jesus Christ! Almighty! The figure on the ridge wore buckskin and cotton, his long black hair loose around his shoulders, a red bandana tied Apache style around his forehead. But it was his eyes that made grown men take involuntary steps backward, dark as winter nights and steady as rifle sights, fixed on the crowd below with the kind of attention that promised swift and final judgment for anyone foolish enough to test his resolve. Kate felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized the stance, the way he held himself like coiled lightning waiting for release. This had to be Ilan, the real Ilan, not the fever-broken man she'd been nursing back to health. The Apache scout had somehow managed to drag himself from her cabin while she'd been arguing with the mob, had somehow found the strength to climb that ridge and position himself where he could see everything, control everything, protect everything he deemed worth protecting. That's him, Marcus Webb breathed, his torch wavering in his suddenly unsteady grip. That's the Apache we came to kill. But even as he spoke the words, Webb was backing away from Kate's cabin, his eyes never leaving the figure on the ridge. Every man in that clearing had heard stories of Apache marksmanship, of warriors who could put a bullet through a playing card at 200 yards, of battles where entire cavalry units had been picked apart by invisible riflemen who struck like ghosts and vanished like smoke. The figure on the ridge lowered his Winchester slowly, deliberately, making sure every man below could see the weapon and calculate their chances of reaching cover before he could fire again. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the distance with the clarity of mountain air and the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The woman is under Apache protection now. Any man who harms her answers to me. Kate felt something shift in her chest at those words, not fear, though she probably should have been afraid, but something closer to recognition. This was what Samuel had always told her about the Apache. They weren't the mindless savages the newspapers made them out to be, but people with their own codes of honor, their own sense of justice, their own ways of deciding who deserved protection and who deserved punishment. And somehow, in the 3 days she'd spent caring for his wounds and fever, she'd earned a place under that protection. Sheriff Bradley raised his hand slowly, making sure his movements couldn't be mistaken for reaching for a weapon. Now, hold on there, friend. We don't want any trouble with you. This is a matter between us and the woman. She's harbored a fugitive Apache warrior, and territorial law says... His words were cut off as the rifle swung toward him with fluid precision, the barrel finding him with the inevitability of a compass needle finding north. Territorial law, Ilan replied, his voice carrying a note of bitter amusement. Says a lot of things about Apache that aren't worth the paper they're written on. Says we're savages who can't be trusted, can't be reasoned with, can't tell the difference between enemy and friend. But that woman down there sat beside my bed for 3 days, fought fever with me, shared her food and her medicine and her fire, when she had every reason to let me die. Apache law says that makes her family, and Apache law says family protects family. The standoff stretched out like a held breath. 23 armed men on the ground facing one Apache warrior on the ridge, all of them calculating odds and consequences, while Kate stood in her doorway, feeling like the eye of a hurricane. She could see the doubt spreading through the crowd now, not just about the wisdom of their mission, but about their chances of surviving it. Men who'd come expecting to burn out a defenseless widow were now facing the possibility of a running gun battle with one of the most feared fighters on the frontier. Martha Henley's voice cut through the tension like a rusty blade. Don't let him fool you with pretty words about family and protection. He's Apache. They're all liars and killers. Shoot him down like the animal he is, or he'll pick us off one. By one from up there like we're rabbits in a warren. But even as she spoke, Martha was edging toward her horse, her earlier bravado evaporating under the steady gaze of the man on the ridge. Elan's attention shifted to Martha with the smooth precision of a predator selecting prey. You want to see Apache justice, woman? Keep talking. Keep calling me animal while you stand there ready to burn an innocent woman alive for showing mercy. Keep telling me about Apache lies while you lie to yourself about what kind of people you've become. The rifle hadn't moved, but somehow its presence seemed more threatening than before, as if the weapon itself had developed a personal interest in Martha Henley's continued existence. Kate found her voice then, stepping forward from her doorway with the sudden realization that she was probably the only person in the clearing who could prevent this from ending in bloodshed. Elan, these people are afraid. They've seen too much death, lost too many friends and family members to raids. They're not evil, they're just... She paused, searching for words that might build a bridge across the chasm of hatred and fear that separated the mob from the man who'd claimed her as family. They're just like the Apache warriors who want to kill me for working with the cavalry. Elan finished for her, his voice softer now but no less determined. Fear makes people do terrible things, Kate Chambers. But fear doesn't excuse those terrible things, and it sure doesn't make them right. These people came here to burn you alive for showing mercy. That's not fear talking, that's hatred, pure and simple. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat carefully, his hands still raised, his voice taking on the cautious tone of a man trying to talk his way out of a rattlesnake den. Look, Apache, we can work this out peaceful-like. Nobody has to die here today. Maybe we all got a little carried away, maybe tempers ran a little hot, but we can't just ignore territorial law, can't pretend like harboring hostile Indians isn't a serious crime. Hostile Indians, Elan repeated, and Kate could hear the bitter laughter in his voice, even though his face remained expressionless. Sheriff, I've been working as a scout for Captain Morrison for 2 years now. I've helped track down war parties, prevented raids, saved white lives. I carry papers signed by 3 different cavalry officers recommending me for military honors. But because I have Apache blood, because I wear my hair long and speak my grandfather's language, I'm automatically hostile in your eyes. He shifted positions slightly on the ridge, and Kate noticed for the first time how carefully he was moving, how he favored his left side where she knew the saber wound was still healing. The climb up that ridge had cost him, but he'd made it anyway, had positioned himself to protect her even though he was still weak from fever and blood loss. The magnitude of that sacrifice hit her like a physical blow, and she felt tears burning, her eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. You're hurt, she called up to him, not caring that every man in the clearing could hear the concern in her voice. You shouldn't be up there. You should be resting, letting those wounds heal properly. The mob stirred restlessly at this evidence of caring between the white woman and the Apache warrior. But Kate found she no longer cared what they thought about her choices. Elan's gaze found hers across the distance, and for a moment his expression softened from winter stone to something almost human. "I'm hurt, yes, but not hurt enough to watch good people suffer for showing kindness. Not hurt enough to let fear and hatred win another victory over mercy and justice. I'll rest when you're safe, Kate Chambers. I'll heal when this is finished, Marcus." Webb took a half-step forward, his massive blacksmith's frame tense with frustration and growing anger. "This is insane. We came here to deal with one problem, and now we've got 2 Apaches to worry about, plus a woman who's clearly chosen sides against her own people. Maybe we should just burn the whole place down and be done with it. Let God sort out who deserves to live and who deserves to die." The Winchester's barrel swung toward Webb with mechanical precision, and the big blacksmith froze mid-step as he found himself staring down the rifle's bore from 200 yards away. "You want to let God sort things out?" Ellen asked, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "Then put down your weapons and your torches and walk away. Let God judge who showed mercy and who showed hatred. Let God decide who acted like a Christian and who acted like the very savages you claim to be fighting." Kate could see the internal struggle playing out on faces throughout the crowd. Some men were clearly ready to retreat, unwilling to risk their lives for what was starting to look like a very complicated situation. Others were equally clearly committed to seeing this through to its bloody conclusion, too invested in their hatred to back down now. And caught between them was Sheriff Bradley, a decent man, trying to do his duty in circumstances that had spiraled far beyond anything the territorial government had prepared him for. "What do you want from us?" Bradley called up to the ridge, his voice heavy with exhaustion and the weight of impossible choices. "What's it going to take to end this without bloodshed? We can't just pretend nothing happened here. Too many people know about the Apache in Kate's cabin. Too many people are demanding justice." "Justice!" Ellen repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. "You want justice, Sheriff? Then arrest the men who shot me off my horse when I was riding to warn your town about a planned Apache raid. Arrest the people who left a cavalry scout to die in the desert without bothering to check his papers or ask his mission. Arrest everyone who came here today, ready to burn an innocent woman alive for showing basic human decency." The silence that followed was broken only by the nervous shifting of horses and the crackle of torches that several men were now holding, as if they'd forgotten what they were for. Kate could see the truth settling over the crowd like dust after a windstorm. The realization that they'd made terrible assumptions, acted on incomplete information, let fear and prejudice guide them toward actions that would have haunted them for the rest of their lives. Martha Henley's voice rose again, shrill with desperation and unrepentant hatred. "Don't listen to him. Can't you see what he's doing? He's trying to turn us against each other, trying to make us doubt ourselves. That's what they do. They get inside your head with lies and manipulation. Kill him now, before he kills us all." But her words fell flat in the morning air, ignored by men who were beginning to see the situation with clearer eyes. The figure on the ridge wasn't behaving like a savage killer or a hostile warrior. He was behaving like a man defending someone he considered family, using the minimum force necessary to prevent tragedy, offering alternatives to violence even while prepared to deliver it if necessary. Elan lowered his rifle slightly, though. It remained ready for instant use. "Kate Chambers," he called down to her, his voice gentler now. "Are you safe in that cabin? Are you hurt? Do you need me to come down there?" The concern in his voice was unmistakable, and Kate felt her heart clench at the realization that this fierce Apache warrior was more worried about her welfare than his own precarious position on the ridge. "I'm safe," Kate called back, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Thanks to you, I'm safe. But Elan, you need to know, these people aren't all bad. Some of them are here because they're genuinely afraid for their families. Some of them helped me bury Samuel, brought me food during the worst winter storms, stood by me when I had nowhere else to turn. They're not monsters, they're just people who let fear make monsters of them, Elan finished quietly. I understand that, Kate. I've seen it before, in Apache camps and cavalry forts and frontier towns. Good people who do terrible things because they're afraid, because they've been told that some kinds of human beings don't count as fully human. But understanding it doesn't mean accepting it, and it sure doesn't mean letting it continue unchallenged. Sheriff Bradley lowered his hand slowly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of decisions he'd never wanted to make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. So what happens? Now, we've got a standoff here, and sooner or later, someone's going to get killed. Maybe we all made mistakes today. Maybe we all could have handled things better. But we need to find a way forward that doesn't end with graves being dug. Elan considered this for a long moment, his dark eyes moving from face to face in the crowd below, assessing threats and possibilities with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years surviving in hostile territory. Here's what happens now, Sheriff. You and your men put down your weapons and your torches. You listen while Kate tells you the whole truth about who I am and why I was coming to your town, and then you decide whether you want to be remembered as the men who almost burned a hero for saving a saint, or as the men who were wise enough to choose mercy over murder when the truth finally came to light. Kate felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. This man, this Apache warrior who owed her nothing more than she owed him, had just called her a saint, had just risked his life to protect her, had just offered her neighbors a path back from the brink of an atrocity that would have stained their souls forever. And all she'd done was what any decent person should do when they find another human being suffering and in need of help. The standoff continued, but something fundamental had shifted in the clearing below Kate's cabin. The torches were lowering. The rifles were pointing toward the ground instead of toward the ridge, and faces that had been twisted with hatred and fear were beginning to show traces of shame and uncertainty. Change was coming to Mesquite Flats, whether its people were ready for it or not, and it was arriving in the form of an Apache scout who understood justice better than the men sworn to uphold it. Colonel Nathaniel Cross arrived in Mesquite Flats 3 days after the standoff at Kate's cabin, and he brought with him the kind of trouble that couldn't be reasoned with or intimidated into backing down. His cavalry troop rode into town at high noon, 30 soldiers in dust-stained blue uniforms, with carbines across their saddles, and the grim expressions of men who'd been riding hard for days, with orders that left no room for interpretation. The townspeople who watched them pass felt their stomachs drop with the certainty that whatever fragile peace had emerged from the confrontation at Willow Creek was about to be shattered like glass under a hammer. Cross himself was everything. The frontier had taught people to fear about military authority. Tall, ramrod straight, with pale blue eyes that looked at the world through the lens of regulations and duty without any apparent concern for human complexity. His graying mustache was perfectly waxed, his uniform immaculate despite the desert ride, and when he spoke, it was with the clipped precision of a man who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through the proper application of force. He'd earned his reputation fighting Apache all across the Southwest, and that reputation included a very specific approach to dealing with anyone who aided or harbored hostile Indians. Kate learned about Cross's arrival from young Tommy Rodriguez, who ran the livery stable and had a gift for being wherever important news was breaking. Tommy burst through her cabin door just after sunset, his dark eyes wide with fear and excitement, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver his message. "Miss Kate, you got to get out of here right now. There's a cavalry colonel in town asking questions about you and that Apache scout. And Sheriff Bradley's been locked up in his own jail for refusing to cooperate with some kind of federal investigation." She felt the blood drain from her face as she absorbed the implications. If Sheriff Bradley, a decent man who'd been trying to find a peaceful solution to an impossible situation, had been arrested for failing to enforce territorial law, then whatever was coming next would make the torch-bearing mob look like a church social. Federal involvement meant this was no longer a local matter that could be resolved through negotiation and compromise. This was now about making examples and sending messages that would echo across every frontier settlement in the territory. "Where's Ilan?" Kate asked, already moving toward the wooden chest where she kept her late husband's Colt revolver and the small stash of gold coins that represented her entire worldly wealth. If they were going to have to run, they'd need money and weapons, and a plan that didn't involve trying to outfight 30 cavalry soldiers with one wounded Apache scout and a woman who'd never shot anything more dangerous than a rattlesnake. Tommy's face went pale. "That's the thing, Miss Kate. Nobody's seen him since yesterday morning. Some folks say he rode out toward Apache territory. Others say he's still around but staying hidden. But Colonel Cross, he's got trackers with him, Pima scouts who can follow sign better than bloodhounds. If that Apache friend of yours is anywhere within 50 miles of here, they're going to find him." Kate felt her hands shake as she loaded the revolver, checking each chamber with the methodical care Samuel had taught her during their first winter on the frontier. Ilan had vanished without a word, without any explanation, just when she needed to know his intentions most desperately. Had he abandoned her to save himself, or was he planning something that required him to move unseen and undetected? The not knowing was almost worse than the fear of what was coming. The sound of boots on her front porch announced visitors before they could knock, and Kate motioned for Tommy to hide behind the wood stove while she moved to answer the door. With the revolver tucked behind her back, she found herself facing two cavalry officers, a young lieutenant with nervous eyes and an older captain whose scarred face spoke of years spent fighting Apache in country that ate white men alive. Behind them stood 4 enlisted men with rifles, their positioning making it clear that this was not a social call. "Mrs. Chambers," the captain said, touching the brim of his hat with perfunctory courtesy. "I'm Captain Morrison, and this is Lieutenant Hayes. Colonel Cross would like to speak with you about the Apache warrior you've been harboring. You'll need to come with us now." His voice carried the flat authority of military orders, but Kate caught something else in his expression. A flicker of recognition when he said his own name, as if he expected her to react to it. "Captain Morrison," Kate repeated slowly, her mind racing as she remembered what Ilan had told her about carrying letters of recommendation from his commanding officer. "You wouldn't happen to be the same Captain Morrison who's been working with Apache scouts to track down hostile war parties, would you? Because if you are, then you might be interested to know that the man I've been caring for is one of your own scouts." The captain's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and Kate saw him exchange a quick glance with the lieutenant before returning his attention to her. "Ma'am, I think there may be some confusion here. The Apache you've been harboring was identified as a hostile warrior, possibly one of Victoria's raiders. Colonel Cross has direct orders from the territorial governor to arrest anyone who's aided enemy combatants." Kate felt a surge of desperate hope mixed with growing dread. If this was indeed the Captain Morrison that Ilan had mentioned, then there might be a chance to resolve this mess without bloodshed. But if Cross had already made up his mind about what had happened here, then the truth might not matter any more than it had mattered to the torch-bearing mob 3 days ago. "Captain, I need you to look at something," Kate said, stepping back from the doorway and gesturing toward the small table where she'd placed Ilan's personal effects during his recovery. "That Apache scout you're calling a hostile warrior left these behind when he climbed up on the ridge to protect me from a lynch mob. Maybe you'd recognize some of them." Morrison stepped into the cabin, his eyes immediately focusing on the leather portfolio that lay open on the table. Kate watched his face change as he saw the official papers inside. Military correspondence, scouting reports, recommendations for commendation, all bearing his own signature and seal. His hands shook slightly as he picked up one of the letters, scanning the familiar words he'd written himself just 2 months earlier. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered, his military composure cracking as the full implications hit him. "This is Elan's gear. These are the reports I sent to Territorial Command recommending him for a Medal of Valor. He's been missing for 6 days. We thought he was dead, thought the war party he was tracking had caught up with him." He looked up at Kate with new respect and something approaching awe. "You saved the life of one of the best scouts in the entire Southwest Territory." Lieutenant Hayes peered over Morrison's shoulder at the papers, his young face showing confusion and growing concern. "Captain, if this Apache is really one of our scouts, then why does Colonel Cross have orders to arrest him as a hostile? Why are we treating this woman like a criminal for giving medical aid to one of our own men?" Morrison's face had gone hard as stone, and Kate could practically see him putting pieces together in his mind, pieces that painted a picture of incompetence, prejudice, and bureaucratic bungling that had nearly resulted in the death of a valuable ally and the persecution of an innocent civilian. Because someone back in Santa Fe saw Apache warrior in a report and stopped reading before they got to the part about him being a cavalry scout, Morrison said grimly. "Because we've got politicians making military decisions based on newspaper headlines instead of actual intelligence." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the conversation, and through the cabin window, Kate could see a large group of riders heading toward her homestead. At their head rode a tall figure in an immaculate cavalry uniform, his bearing unmistakably that of a senior officer accustomed to absolute obedience. Colonel Cross had apparently grown tired of waiting for his subordinates to complete their simple arrest mission. "Captain Morrison," Cross's voice carried clearly through the evening air as he reined in his horse just outside Kate's front door. "I trust you've completed the arrest of the Indian sympathizer and gathered the evidence we need to prosecute this case to the fullest extent of territorial law. The governor is most anxious to demonstrate that federal authority will not tolerate collaboration with hostile savages." Morrison stepped out of the cabin, the leather portfolio clutched in his hands, his face showing the strain of a career military man about to contradict a superior officer in front of enlisted men. "Colonel, there's been a significant misunderstanding here. The Apache this woman aided isn't a hostile warrior. He's one of my scouts, a man who's served the cavalry with distinction for over 2 years. Cross's pale eyes fixed on Morrison, with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "Captain, I have direct reports identifying the Apache in question as a member of Victorio's war party. I have witness statements from reliable citizens describing his hostile behavior and war paint. Are you suggesting that multiple witnesses and official intelligence reports are all mistaken?" "I'm suggesting that reliable citizens sometimes see what they expect to see rather than what's actually there," Morrison replied, his voice steady despite the career-ending risk he was taking. "And I'm stating categorically that the man Mrs. Chambers helped is my scout, a man who was carrying official cavalry documents when he was shot by civilians who didn't bother to identify him before opening fire." Cross dismounted with fluid precision, his boots hitting the ground with the finality of a judge's gavel. Around him, 30 cavalry soldiers watched the confrontation between their commanding officer and his subordinate with the uncomfortable attention of men witnessing something that could reshape the entire territorial command structure. Kate felt Tommy's small hand clutch her skirt as the boy tried to make himself invisible behind the wood stove. "Captain Morrison," Cross said, his voice dropping to a tone that somehow managed to be both quiet and threatening. "You seem to have developed an unfortunate attachment to Apache welfare that's clouding your military judgment. Perhaps extended contact with these savages has compromised your ability to distinguish between legitimate intelligence and enemy propaganda. Step aside and allow me to complete this arrest as ordered." Morrison straightened to his full height, and Kate could see him making the decision that would define the rest of his career. "No, sir, I will not step aside. Mrs. Chambers is under my protection as a civilian who aided a cavalry scout in the performance of his duties. Any attempt to arrest her will be opposed by myself and any of my men who still remember their oath to protect innocent civilians." The silence that followed was electric with tension, 30 soldiers trying to decide whether they were witnessing a heroic stand for justice or a mutinous challenge to military authority. Kate found herself holding her breath, acutely aware that her fate and possibly Elon's hung in the balance of whatever happened in the next few minutes. Cross's hand moved to rest on the butt of his service revolver, not drawing the weapon, but making sure everyone present understood that he was prepared to escalate this confrontation as far as necessary. "Captain, you are relieved of command effective immediately." Lieutenant Hayes placed Captain Morrison under arrest for insubordination and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Then complete the original mission as ordered. But Lieutenant Hayes didn't move. The young officer stood frozen between his immediate superior and his commanding colonel, his face pale with the realization that his next decision would echo through the rest of his military career. Around him, enlisted men shifted nervously, hands moving toward weapons while they tried to figure out which officer they were supposed to obey. "Lieutenant," Cross snapped, his voice cracking like a whip, "I gave you a direct order. Arrest Captain Morrison immediately, or find yourself facing the same charges of insubordination and conduct unbecoming an officer." But even as he spoke, Cross could see the uncertainty spreading through his command like wildfire. Too many of these men had served under Morrison, had seen him lead from the front and protect their lives in Apache country. They weren't prepared to turn on him without more compelling evidence than Cross's word. That's when the war cry split the evening air like a blade through silk, high and wild and unmistakably Apache, coming from the ridge above Kate's cabin, where a figure had materialized as if conjured from the gathering darkness. Elan stood silhouetted against the dying light, no longer the wounded man who'd needed Kate's care, but the fierce warrior whose reputation had spread across every cavalry post in the territory. In his hands he carried not just his Winchester, but a cavalry bugle that gleamed like gold in the sunset. And as the soldiers below turned to stare at him in shock, he raised the bugle to his lips and sounded the clear, piercing notes of assembly. The bugle call echoed across the desert, carrying farther than any human voice could reach, and within moments answering calls began to sound from ridges and arroyos all around Mesquite Flats. Not Apache war cries this time, but cavalry bugles responding to the ancient signal that meant soldiers were in danger and required immediate assistance. Elan had somehow managed to contact other cavalry units in the area, had somehow coordinated a response that would make it impossible for Cross to complete his mission without risking a pitched battle against his own forces. Cross's face went white as he realized the trap that had been laid for him. He'd come to Mesquite Flats, expecting to arrest one woman and intimidate a small frontier town into compliance with territorial policy. Instead, he found himself surrounded by his own cavalry units, commanded by officers who might not be sympathetic to his heavy-handed approach to justice. The political cover he'd counted on was evaporating as rapidly as morning dew in the desert sun. Kate felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth as she watched 30 of the most dangerous fighting men in the territory realize they'd been outmaneuvered by a wounded Apache scout and a frontier woman who'd refused to compromise her principles for the sake of political convenience. The gathering storm was about to break over Colonel Cross's head, and Kate had the distinct feeling that when the thunder stopped rolling, the landscape of territorial justice would be permanently changed. The first cavalry unit to arrive came, thundering down the mesa trail like vengeance wrapped in blue wool and brass buttons, their horses lathered with sweat and their carbons glinting in the last rays of desert sunlight. Major William Garrett led the charge, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that bugle calls in Apache country meant life-or-death situations that required immediate response. Behind him rode 20 veteran troopers who'd learned to trust. Apache scouts with their lives, men who knew the difference between political posturing and genuine military emergency. Kate watched from her doorway as Garrett reined in his mount and took in the scene with the practiced eye of an officer who'd spent 15 years keeping the peace in hostile territory. His gaze moved from Colonel Cross's immaculate uniform to Captain Morrison's defiant stance to the 30 soldiers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world than caught between competing authorities. When Garrett's eyes finally found Elon on the ridge, still holding the cavalry bugle that had summoned this reinforcement, his expression shifted to something approaching relief. "Scout Elan," Garrett called up to the ridge, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of, "Long partnership, your signal said emergency assistance required. What's the situation here?" But even as he spoke, Garrett's attention was drawn to Colonel Cross, whose pale face had gone rigid with barely controlled fury at this unexpected complication. The Major's expression hardened as he recognized the political dimensions of whatever confrontation he'd ridden into. Cross stepped forward, his hand still resting on his service revolver, his voice pitched to carry the absolute authority of federal command. "Major Garrett, I'm conducting an official investigation into civilian collaboration with hostile Apache forces. Your scout appears to have compromised his position by developing inappropriate attachments to enemy sympathizers. I'll need you to place him under immediate arrest." The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a dying fire, and Kate could see the shock ripple through Garrett's troopers as they processed what their colonel was ordering. These were men who'd ridden with Elan, who'd seen him track war parties through impossible terrain and guide cavalry columns away from deadly ambushes. The idea of arresting him as a hostile seemed as absurd as arresting their own horses for being too fast. Garrett's mount shifted restlessly beneath him as the Major studied Colonel Cross with the careful attention of a poker player trying to read a dangerous opponent. "Colonel, with respect, Scout Elan has been officially commended by Territorial Command for exceptional service. His last mission involved tracking a war party that was planning to attack civilian settlements. Any investigation into his conduct would need to go through proper channels, not field arrests based on unsubstantiated accusations." "Unsubstantiated?" Cross's voice rose to a pitch that made his horse sidestep nervously. "Major, I have witness testimony that this Apache was found in the cabin of a known Indian sympathizer, being nursed back to health after what was clearly combat with loyal American forces. The woman has admitted to harboring him, feeding him, and providing medical care that enabled him to continue his hostile activities. The evidence is overwhelming." Captain Morrison stepped forward, the leather portfolio still clutched in his hands like a shield against institutional stupidity. "Colonel Cross, the evidence you're referring to consists of statements from civilians who shot an unarmed cavalry scout and left him for dead without bothering to check his identity. Mrs. Chambers didn't harbor a hostile. She saved the life of one of our most valuable assets while we were searching half the territory for his body." The sound of approaching riders interrupted Morrison's defense, and Kate felt her heart sink as she recognized Martha Henley leading another group of townspeople toward her cabin. Unlike the earlier mob with their torches and rope, this group carried the grim determination of people who decided that legal authority was more important than messy questions about truth and justice. They positioned themselves behind Colonel Cross like a Greek chorus of righteous indignation. Martha's voice cut through the evening air with the sharp edge of moral certainty. Major Garrett, don't let these military politics confuse the real issue here. This woman violated territorial law by aiding hostile Indians, and that Apache up on the ridge has been terrorizing our community for days. We demand justice according to the law, not some backroom deal between officers who've gotten too comfortable working with savages. Kate felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized how perfectly Martha's words aligned with Cross's agenda. The colonel had found civilian allies who would support his version of events, people whose testimony would carry weight with territorial authorities back in Santa Fe. The political cover he'd lost when Morrison challenged his orders was being restored by townspeople who genuinely believed they were serving justice. Elan's voice carried down from the ridge with the clarity of mountain air and the authority of someone who'd finally decided to speak his complete truth. Major Garrett, these people want to hear about hostile Apache activities. Let me tell them about the war party I've been tracking for 3 weeks. 20 warriors led by a renegade named Black Wolf, who's been raiding supply trains and murdering civilians from here to the Mexican border. The clearing fell silent as Elan continued, his words measured and precise. I was following their trail when civilian gunfire put me on the ground 3 miles from Mrs. Chambers' cabin. While I was unconscious with fever, Black Wolf's warriors hit the Morrison ranch and killed a family of 5. While good Christian folks were planning to burn me alive for being Apache, Black Wolf was preparing to attack Mesquite Flats itself. The raid was scheduled for yesterday, but my bugle signals warned the war party that cavalry reinforcements were in the area. Major, Garrett's face went pale as the implications hit him. Elan, are you saying there's an active war party in the immediate area? That civilian interference with your mission may have prevented us from stopping a major raid? His hand moved instinctively to his carbine as he scanned the surrounding ridges with new attention to tactical positioning. I'm saying that while these people were debating whether to murder a cavalry scout for being Apache, real hostiles were planning to murder their entire town for being white, Ellen replied, his voice carrying across the desert with devastating clarity. I'm saying that Mrs. Chambers saved more than my life when she pulled me back from death's door. She saved every person in Mesquite Flats by giving me the strength to coordinate defensive measures that kept Black Wolf's war party at bay. Colonel. Cross's face had gone from pale to flushed red as he realized how completely his narrative was being dismantled by inconvenient facts. This is exactly the kind of Apache manipulation I was warning about, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Classic savage tactics: create confusion, play on white guilt, make us doubt our own people in favor of enemy claims that can't be verified. But Martha Henley was staring at Elan with growing horror as pieces began falling into place in her mind. The Morrison Ranch, she whispered, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. We heard about the killings, but the cavalry said it was random violence, said there was no pattern to the attacks. She turned to Major Garrett with desperate hope. Tell me he's lying. Tell me there isn't really a war party out there planning to kill us all. Garrett's expression was grim as he pulled out his field glasses and began scanning the horizon. Mrs. Henley, in 15 years of fighting Apache, I've never known Scout Elan to lie about tactical situations. If he says there's a war party in the area, then we need to prepare for immediate defensive action. He turned to his sergeant, his voice dropping to the clipped tones of military emergency. Sergeant Mitchell, deploy the men in defensive positions around the settlement. Send riders to warn outlying homesteads. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. 30 seconds earlier, they'd been debating the arrest of an Indian sympathizer and her Apache protector. Now they were preparing for a battle that could determine whether Mesquite Flats survived the night. Soldiers who'd been uncertain about their loyalties were suddenly moving with the coordinated precision of men whose survival depended on trusting their Apache scouts' intelligence. Lieutenant Hayes, who'd been silent through most of the confrontation, finally found his voice. "Colonel Cross, sir, if there's an active hostile war party in the area, shouldn't our priority be defending civilian lives rather than pursuing arrests based on territorial policy?" His young face showed the strain of an officer trying to reconcile competing duties while people's lives hung in the balance. Cross's jaw clenched as he realized his carefully planned operation was dissolving into chaos around him. "Lieutenant, our orders from Territorial Command are clear and specific. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. We cannot allow political considerations or unsubstantiated Apache claims to interfere with the enforcement of federal law. The arrest of Indian sympathizers sends a message that collaboration with hostiles will not be tolerated." That's when the first gunshot rang out from the ridge opposite Elan's position, followed immediately by the distinctive war cry of Apache warriors launching an attack. The sound cut through the evening air like a blade, and suddenly the political debate became irrelevant as everyone in the clearing realized they were caught in the open during the opening moments of a coordinated assault. Kate felt time slow down as chaos erupted around her cabin. Soldiers dove for cover behind rocks and trees, their carbines snapping up toward the ridges where muzzle flashes were beginning to bloom like deadly flowers in the gathering darkness. Townspeople screamed and scattered, some running toward their horses, while others pressed themselves flat against the ground in desperate attempts to avoid the bullets that were beginning to whine overhead. Elan's Winchester began speaking. From his position on the ridge, each shot precise and deadly as he targeted Apache warriors who thought they were attacking unprepared civilians. Kate could see him moving along the rocky outcrop with fluid grace, using every boulder and depression for cover while his rifle found targets that nobody else could even see. This was what he'd been trained for, what he'd spent years perfecting, the deadly art of fighting his own people to protect the people who'd become his chosen family. Major Garrett's voice rose above the gunfire as he tried to impose order on a situation that was rapidly spiraling toward disaster. "Take cover and return fire. Sergeant Mitchell, get those townspeople behind the cabin where they'll have some protection. Captain Morrison, can you get a count on hostile numbers?" But even as he shouted orders, Garrett was scanning the ridges with growing concern. This wasn't a random raid. This was a coordinated attack designed to catch them in a killing ground. Colonel Cross, his immaculate uniform now dusty from diving behind Kate's woodpile, raised his revolver toward the ridges with hands that shook from rage rather than fear. "This is Apache treachery at its finest," he shouted over the gunfire. "They coordinate attacks with their scout allies, then claim to be protecting us when the shooting starts. Classic savage tactics, but his words were lost in the thunder of battle as Black Wolf's warriors pressed their attack with the desperate fury of men who knew this might be their last chance to strike a meaningful blow against the white invasion of their homeland. Arrows began falling among the soldiers like deadly rain, and Kate realized with crystal clarity that all the political debates and moral arguments in the world wouldn't matter if they couldn't survive the next 10 minutes. Captain Morrison crawled over to where Kate crouched behind her cabin wall, his service revolver in one hand and Elan's papers still clutched in the other. "Mrs. Chambers, we need to get you to better cover. If those warriors break through our perimeter, they're going to target civilians first." His face was grim with the knowledge that 30 soldiers might not be enough to hold off a determined Apache assault in terrain that favored the attackers. Kate looked up at the ridge where Elan continued his deadly work, his Winchester never seeming to run empty as he picked off warriors who exposed themselves for even a moment. "Captain, I'm not leaving without him. That man risked everything to protect me, and I'm not abandoning him now when he's fighting to save this entire town." Her voice carried absolute determination, despite the bullets whining overhead and the war cries echoing from the surrounding hills. A new sound joined the chaos, the deep boom of a cavalry cannon that Garrett's men had somehow managed to unlimber and bring into action. The artillery rounds began exploding among the Apache, positions with devastating effect, sending rock fragments and smoke billowing across the ridges. But instead of breaking the attack, the cannon fire seemed to enrage the warriors further, and their assault intensified with suicidal desperation. That's when Kate saw him. Black Wolf himself, the war chief who'd been terrorizing the territory for months, leading a final charge down the slope toward the cabin where the cavalry officers were directing the defense. His war paint was stark white and black in the muzzle flashes, his lance decorated with scalps that caught the firelight like grisly trophies. He was heading straight for Colonel Cross, and Kate realized that the Apache leader had identified the highest-ranking officer as his primary target. Elan saw the same threat developing, and Kate watched in amazement as he abandoned his protected position on the ridge and began running down the slope toward the cabin, his Winchester firing as fast as he could work the lever action. He was exposing himself to fire from dozens of Apache warriors, risking certain death to intercept Black Wolf before the war chief could reach the cavalry officers who were trying to coordinate the defense. The two Apache warriors met in front of Kate's cabin in a collision that seemed to shake the earth itself. Black Wolf's lance thrust toward Elan's chest, while Elan's rifle butt swung toward the war chief's skull, and for a moment that seemed to last forever. The fate of everyone in Mesquite Flats hung in the balance of single combat between two men who represented completely different visions of what it meant to be Apache in a changing world. The knife that ended Black Wolf's war came not from Elan's hand, but from the war chief's own belt, turned against him in a move so swift and precise that most witnesses missed it entirely. One moment, the two Apache warriors were locked in mortal combat beside Kate's cabin, Black Wolf's lance seeking Elan's heart, while war cries echoed from the surrounding ridges. And the next moment, the renowned war chief was falling to his knees, with his own blade buried between his ribs and his eyes wide with the shock of a man who'd never expected to die at the hands of another Apache. The silence that followed was more profound than the battle noise that had preceded it. A stillness so complete that Kate could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears and the soft whisper of desert wind through the cottonwood leaves. On the ridges around Mesquite Flats, Apache warriors who'd been pressing their attack with desperate fury suddenly found themselves leaderless, their war chief dead, at the feet of the scout they'd been taught to consider a traitor to his own people. The night air, still thick with gunpowder smoke and the metallic scent of blood, seemed to hold its breath as both sides processed what they'd just witnessed. Elan stood over Black Wolf's body, blood streaming from a dozen cuts in his chest, heaving with exhaustion, but his dark eyes remained alert as he scanned the ridges where hostile warriors were beginning to emerge from cover with their hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. His buckskin shirt was torn and stained, his long black hair had come loose from its braids, and war paint mixed with dust and sweat had transformed his face into something that looked carved from the desert stones themselves. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried across the battlefield with the authority of a man who'd just proven his loyalty in the most definitive way possible. "Warriors of the Chiricahua," Elan called out in Apache, his words echoing off the canyon walls while the cavalry soldiers maintained their positions but held their fire. Kate didn't understand the language, but she could hear the pain in his voice, the grief of a man who'd been forced to kill someone who might have been a brother in different circumstances. Black Wolf is dead by Apache justice, killed by Apache, hence for leading you into a war that could never be won. The time for raiding is over. The time for dying in hopeless battles is over. Come down from the ridges and let us find a path forward that doesn't end with all our children growing up as orphans." Kate watched in amazement as, one by one, Apache warriors began climbing down from their positions on the surrounding ridges. Their weapons lowered but not discarded, their faces showing the complex mixture of grief and relief that comes with the end of a war they'd known was already lost. These weren't the savage killers of frontier nightmares. They were men, some, barely more than boys, who'd been following a charismatic leader into battles that served pride more than practicality. Their buckskin leggings were torn from scrambling over rocks, their faces painted for war, but their eyes showing the hollow exhaustion of fighters who'd been pushed beyond endurance. Major Garrett stepped forward slowly, his carbine held it, ready, but pointed toward the ground in a gesture of cautious respect. His weathered face showed the strain of an officer trying to process a situation that fell outside every regulation and protocol in the military manual. 15 years of fighting Apache had taught him to recognize the difference between a temporary tactical pause and something more permanent, and what he was seeing now had the weight of historical significance. "Scout Elan," he said carefully, his voice carrying across the clearing with military precision. "What exactly just happened here? Are we looking at a surrender, a temporary ceasefire, or something else entirely?" Colonel Cross emerged from behind the woodpile where he'd taken cover during the battle, his immaculate uniform now torn and dusty, his pale eyes blazing with fury at finding himself forced to witness the complete collapse of his carefully constructed narrative about Apache treachery and civilian collaboration. His pristine appearance had been his armor against the complexities of frontier reality, and now that armor lay in tatters around him like everything else he'd believed about the nature of civilization and savagery. "Major Garrett, don't be fooled by this theatrical display," he snapped, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "This is exactly the kind of Apache manipulation I've been warning about, staged conflicts designed to make us believe we can trust these savages. Black Wolf was probably working with this scout all along, planning to fake his death to earn our sympathy." But his words were drowned out by an unexpected voice from the group of surrendering warriors, a young Apache brave who stepped forward, with his rifle held across his chest in a gesture of formal presentation. He couldn't have been more than 20 years old, but his bearing showed the natural authority of someone born to leadership, and the intricate beadwork on his war shirt spoke of high rank within the tribe. "Major," the warrior said in heavily accented but clear English, his words careful but determined, "I am Two Hawks, nephew to Black Wolf and son of Windrunner, who died in the canyon fight 2 summers past. I speak for warriors who follow me now that War Chief is dead. We do not surrender to white soldiers like defeated dogs, but we lay down weapons in respect for Apache Scout, who showed us that courage means knowing when to stop fighting hopeless." Their battles. The admission sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd of soldiers and civilians, because it meant that Elan hadn't just killed Black Wolf in self-defense. He'd deliberately challenged and defeated the war chief in single combat to end a conflict that was destroying both sides. It was a level of tactical and moral sophistication that shattered every stereotype about Apache savagery and white civilization, revealing layers of honor and strategic thinking that most whites had never imagined possible among people they'd been taught to consider subhuman. Captain Morrison moved to stand beside Elan, the leather portfolio of official documents still clutched in his hands, like evidence in a trial that was finally receiving proper consideration. His uniform showed the wear of a career spent in Apache country, and his scarred hands spoke of battles fought alongside the very scouts that territorial policy now condemned as unreliable. "Colonel Cross," Morrison said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd seen his judgment vindicated by events. "I believe we owe Mrs. Chambers and Scout Elan a considerable apology." Not only did they not collaborate with hostile forces, they prevented a massacre that would have cost dozens of civilian lives. Furthermore, Scout Elan just ended a war that's been bleeding this territory white for 6 months. Martha Henley, who'd been watching the surrender from behind Kate's cabin wall with the wide-eyed expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been turned upside down, finally found her voice. Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled from diving for cover during the battle, and her face showed the strain of a woman confronting the possibility that her most fundamental beliefs about good and evil might be completely wrong. "I don't understand," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "If that Apache scout was really working for the cavalry, if he was really trying to protect us, then why didn't he just tell us who he was from the beginning? Why let us believe he was hostile when he could have prevented all this confusion?" Kate felt a surge of protective anger on Elan's behalf, remembering the fever dreams and pain-racked nights when he'd been too weak to defend himself against accusations and assumptions. She thought of the way he'd clutched that silver cross while delirious, the way he'd called out names in Spanish and English, as well as Apache, the way he'd tried to show her his papers even when barely conscious. "He tried to tell you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing with the authority of someone who'd witnessed the truth firsthand. "He was carrying official papers, wearing cavalry-issued gear, and bearing wounds from fighting the same war party that killed the Morrison family. He showed me letters of commendation signed by Captain Morrison himself. But you saw Apache features and stopped looking at anything else. You decided what you wanted to believe before you bothered to examine the evidence, and your prejudice nearly got all of us killed." The silence that followed was heavy with shame and recognition, as townspeople and soldiers alike began to understand how completely their prejudices had blinded them to reality. Men who'd been ready to burn Kate alive for showing mercy to an enemy were now forced to confront the fact that she'd been caring for one of their most valuable protectors while they'd been preparing to commit murder in the name of justice. Women who'd spat at the mention of her name were realizing that her mercy had saved their children's lives. Marcus Webb, the massive blacksmith whose torch had been one of the first raised against Kate's cabin just days earlier, stepped forward, with his hat in his hands and his bearded face showing genuine remorse. "Mrs. Chambers," he said, his deep voice rough with emotion, "I owe you an apology that words can't properly express. My boy Jimmy is alive tonight because you had the courage to do what was right when the rest of us were too afraid and too angry to think straight. I came here ready to burn you as a traitor, and you were the one who saved us all from becoming the very monsters we thought we were fighting." Other voices began joining in, a chorus of admissions and apologies from people who'd let fear and hatred guide them toward actions they were now desperate to undo. Kate saw tears in the eyes of women who'd crossed themselves at her approach, shame in the faces of men who'd loaded rifles with the intention of ending her life. The transformation wasn't complete. She could still see stubborn resentment in some faces, people whose prejudices ran too deep to be changed by mere evidence. But it was enough to restore her faith in human decency. Elan walked over to where Kate stood, his movements careful because of his wounds, but his bearing still carrying the quiet dignity that had impressed her from their first meeting. Blood from his fight with Black Wolf had mixed with the dust of battle to create war paint more authentic than anything the hostile warriors had worn. But his dark eyes held the same gentle intelligence that had convinced her to trust him when he'd been helpless in her cabin. The silver cross he wore around his neck caught the firelight, and Kate could see that it bore Spanish inscriptions that spoke of a faith that transcended racial boundaries. "Kate Chambers," he said softly, his voice meant for her alone, though everyone in the clearing strained to hear his words. "You saved more than my life when you pulled me back from the edge of death. You saved the lives of everyone in this town, and you saved the honor of people who were about to make mistakes they could never have lived with. Your mercy became a bridge between worlds that seemed destined to destroy each other. You showed them what it means to be truly civilized when civilization itself was failing. She felt tears burning her eyes as she looked at this man who'd just risked everything to protect people who'd never shown him anything but suspicion and hatred. His willingness to kill Black Wolf, a fellow Apache, possibly even a distant relative, to protect a community that had been ready to burn him alive, spoke of a moral courage that shamed every person in that clearing. Ilan, I just did what any decent person would do when they found someone suffering. I never imagined it would lead to all this. She gestured toward the surrendering warriors, the shame-faced townspeople, the cavalry officers who were trying to figure out how to write reports that would explain the night's events to their superiors. Colonel Cross, his face flushed with a rage that seemed to be consuming him from the inside out, stepped forward with his service revolver drawn and pointed directly at Elan's chest. His hand trembled with fury rather than fear, and his voice when he spoke carried the desperate edge of a man watching his entire worldview collapse around him. "This stops now," he said, his words shaking with barely controlled violence. "I don't care what kind of show you put on here. I don't care how many people you fooled with your Apache tricks. You're still a savage, and she's still a traitor to her own race for helping you. Federal law is federal law, and I'm placing both of you under arrest for collaboration with hostile forces." The click of 30 carbines being cocked simultaneously echoed across the clearing like the sound of fate itself taking a hand in human affairs. Major Garrett's troopers had their weapons trained on Colonel Cross with the precision of men who'd decided that some orders were too morally bankrupt to obey, regardless of the consequences for their military careers. These were soldiers who'd ridden with Apache scouts, who'd seen them die protecting white settlements, who understood the difference between legitimate military authority and the abuse of power. "Colonel," Major Garrett said quietly, his own sidearm now pointed at his superior officer, "you're relieved of command for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Any attempt to arrest civilians who've aided cavalry personnel in the performance of their duties will be met with appropriate force. Stand down immediately or face the consequences of your actions. I've spent 15 years in this territory, and I've learned to recognize honor when I see it, regardless of what skin it wears." Cross's pale eyes darted around the circle of weapons pointed in his direction, and Kate could see the exact moment when he realized that his authority had evaporated like water in the desert sun. The soldiers who'd ridden with him from Santa Fe were now backing away, unwilling to support actions that violated every principle of military honor they'd sworn to uphold. Even his own aide, Lieutenant Hayes, had drawn his weapon and was pointing it at his commanding officer with the grim determination of a young man who decided that some lines could not be crossed. "This is mutiny," Cross whispered, his revolver wavering in his suddenly unsteady grip. "This is treason. You're all traitors to your oath, traitors to federal authority, traitors to the white race itself. History will remember you as the men who chose savage allies over Christian civilization." But his words carried no weight now, had become the desperate rantings of a man whose prejudices had led him so far from reality that he could no longer distinguish between duty and hatred, between justice and vengeance. Two hawks stepped forward with the natural authority of a man who just inherited leadership of a war party that no longer wanted to fight. His young face bore the ritual scars of Apache manhood, but his eyes held a wisdom that seemed far older than his years. "White Colonel," he said, his English careful but clear, "Apache warriors have honor code that says some fights are not worth Winning. Your fight against mercy and justice is such a fight. We who killed white families in anger understand this better than you who wear white uniform but carry Apache hatred in your heart. You shame the people you claim to protect. The words struck Cross like physical blows, and Kate watched his face crumble as he realized that hostile Apache warriors were lecturing him about honor, while his own soldiers treated him like an enemy of everything they'd sworn to protect. His revolver dropped to his side as the last of his resistance collapsed, and he stood swaying like a man who'd just discovered that everything he'd believed about himself had been a carefully constructed lie. Sheriff Bradley chose that moment to emerge from the darkness at the edge of the clearing, moving slowly with his hands clearly visible and his expression showing the careful neutrality of a lawman trying to navigate a situation that had moved far beyond anything in his experience. He'd obviously been watching the confrontation from concealment, probably trying to determine which side represented legitimate authority and which represented chaos. "Major Garrett," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of civilian law enforcement. "I've been observing from the ridge for the past hour, and I think it's time we had a conversation about what really happened here tonight and how we're going to explain it to territorial authorities." Kate felt a surge of relief at seeing the sheriff, who'd been locked up by Cross's men, but had apparently managed to escape in the confusion of the battle. Bradley was a fair man who'd been caught between impossible pressures, and his presence might provide the neutral authority needed to sort through the legal and political implications of the night's events. His weathered face showed the strain of recent days, but his eyes held the steady resolve of a man who decided to let truth guide his actions rather than political expediency. "Sheriff," Major Garrett replied, his weapon still trained on Colonel Cross, but his voice showing the respect due to civilian authority. "We've had a revelation here tonight about the true nature of recent events in your territory. It appears that Colonel Cross has been operating on flawed intelligence and has attempted to arrest loyal cavalry personnel and the civilians who aided them. Furthermore, he's refused to acknowledge evidence that contradicts his predetermined conclusions about Apache hostility." Bradley nodded slowly, his weathered face showing the strain of a man trying to process information that challenged everything he'd been told by federal authorities. "Major, I've got witness statements from a dozen townspeople who now remember seeing cavalry gear and official papers in Mrs. Chambers' cabin. I've got Apache warriors who confirm that Scout Elan was tracking their war party, not leading it, and I've got a federal colonel who tried to arrest his own men for doing their duty. The picture that's emerging suggests we've all been operating on assumptions that had very little connection to reality. The implications hung in the desert air like smoke from a dying fire, and Kate realized that what had started as a simple act of mercy toward a wounded stranger had become a catalyst for examining the very foundations of justice and authority on the American frontier. The revelation wasn't just about Elan's true identity or her own innocence. It was about whether civilization would be defined by compassion or by hatred, by truth or by convenient prejudice, by the courage to admit mistakes or by the stubbornness to defend them regardless of consequences. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Kate Chambers stood in the doorway of what had once been a simple trading post and was now something unprecedented in the New Mexico territory, a place where Apache and Mexican and white children sat side by side learning to read from the same books, where their mothers traded recipes and remedies without regard to the color of skin or the shape of eyes, where their fathers conducted business based on handshakes rather than suspicion. The morning sun, streaming through the windows, illuminated faces that told the story of a frontier community that had learned to define civilization by compassion rather than conquest. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't happened without resistance. In the weeks following the confrontation at her cabin, Kate had faced investigations from 3 different territorial agencies, each one seeking to determine whether she represented a dangerous precedent or a valuable example of successful Indian relations. Politicians in Santa Fe had demanded explanations for how a simple act of mercy had exposed such massive failures in federal policy, while newspaper editors from as far away as Denver had arrived to write sensational stories about the woman who'd harbored an Apache and lived to tell about it. But the real changes had begun when Two Hawks and his warriors, true to their word about laying down weapons in respect for Elan's courage, had established a camp just outside Mesquite Flats and begun the slow process of learning to live as neighbors rather than enemies. The young war chief had proven to be a natural diplomat, speaking 3 languages and possessing an intuitive understanding of how to bridge cultural gaps that had seemed unbridgeable. His warriors, many of them barely out of boyhood, had skills that frontier communities desperately needed: tracking, hunting, knowledge of medicinal plants, and most importantly, intimate familiarity with the desert that could mean the difference between life and death for white settlers still learning to survive in harsh country. Kate walked across the classroom floor, stepping carefully around children who sat in circles on hand-woven rugs, their voices blending together as they practiced reading aloud from books that Elan had somehow acquired from army suppliers. You know, Apache children had learned English with startling speed, while the white and Mexican children were picking up basic Apache phrases that would serve them well in a territory where 3 cultures were learning to coexist. Maria Santos, the Mexican woman whose husband had been killed in one of Black Wolf's raids, now taught alongside Kate, her presence a testament to forgiveness that had shocked even those who considered themselves good Christians. Miss Kate called out little Sarah Morrison, daughter of the captain who defended Elan's honor against Colonel Cross. Two Hawks says his grandfather knew a medicine that could help my mama's cough. Should I ask him to show us how to make it? The 8-year-old girl spoke with the casual acceptance of childhood, unconscious of how remarkable it was that she felt comfortable seeking Apache remedies for her mother's ailments. Her blonde braids hung beside the black hair of Apache children, and her blue eyes showed none of the fear that had once characterized white attitudes toward their Indian neighbors. Kate smiled as she knelt beside the mixed group of children, who were working on arithmetic problems that involved calculating fair trades between different communities: Apache horses for Mexican corn, white manufactured goods for Indian medicinal knowledge. The lessons were practical rather than theoretical, preparing these children for a world where success would depend on their ability to work across cultural boundaries rather than within them. That sounds like a wonderful idea, Sarah. Why don't you ask Two Hawks to come speak to the whole class about traditional medicine? The door opened to admit Elan, who'd been serving as the unofficial peace coordinator between the Apache camp and the town of Mesquite Flats, his official cavalry. Duties having evolved into something more diplomatic than military. He wore a mixture of white and Apache clothing, cavalry boots with buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt beneath a beaded vest, his long hair braided with both feathers, and a small silver cross that caught the morning light. His face still bore scars from his fight with Black Wolf, but they'd healed into marks of honor rather than disfigurement. "Kate," he said softly, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of friendship that had deepened over months of working together to build. Something new from the ashes of old hatreds. Major Garrett just received word from Santa Fe. The territorial governor wants to meet with you and Two Hawks next month to discuss establishing similar programs in other frontier communities. It seems that Washington is finally interested in solutions that don't involve bullets and broken treaties. Kate felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension at the news. The success of their small experiment in Mesquite Flats had attracted attention from politicians who were beginning to understand that the old approaches to Indian relations were bankrupt, both morally and practically. But she also knew that scaling up their informal arrangements would mean dealing with bureaucracy and regulations that could strangle the spontaneous cooperation that had made everything possible. "Do you think it's a good idea?" she asked, studying Elan's face for signs of the wisdom that had guided him through impossible situations. "I worry that once politicians and bureaucrats get involved, they'll turn what we've built here into something cold and official, something that loses the human connections that make it work." Elan nodded slowly, understanding her concern, but seeing larger possibilities that her natural caution might be overlooking. "I think we have to try," he replied. "What we've proven here is that Apache and whites can live together as neighbors instead of enemies, that children can learn from each other regardless of the color of their skin, that communities can be stronger when they include everyone instead of excluding people based on fear. If we don't share what we've learned, then all the good we've done stays trapped in this one place." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and through the window Kate could see a familiar figure dismounting outside. The trading post. Sheriff Bradley, who'd become one of their strongest supporters in the territorial government, had the satisfied expression of a man bringing good news. Behind him rode Captain Morrison, now promoted to Major after his courageous stand against Colonel Cross, and with them came a woman Kate didn't recognize, well-dressed, intelligent-looking, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mrs. Chambers," Sheriff Bradley called out as he entered the classroom, his hat in his hands and his weathered face showing the respect that had replaced his earlier uncertainty about her choices. "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Elizabeth Colfax from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She's been appointed to head a new commission on peaceful Indian relations, and she's traveled all the way from Washington to see what you've accomplished here." Mrs. Colfax stepped forward with the confident grace of a woman who'd learned to navigate male-dominated government circles without losing her essential humanity. Her dark hair was streaked with premature grey that suggested years of dealing with difficult problems, and her brown eyes held the intelligence of someone who understood complex situations. "Mrs. Chambers," she said, extending her hand in a gesture of equality that surprised Kate. "I've read the reports about what happened here 6 months ago, but I wanted to see for myself how you've managed to create something that our best minds in Washington have been saying was impossible." Kate shook the offered hand, noting the calluses that suggested this government official had experience with practical work rather than just theoretical knowledge. "Mrs. Colfax, I hope you'll understand that what we've built here wasn't planned by any government agency or guided by any official policy. It grew out of people deciding to treat each other as human beings rather than as representatives of hostile races. I'm not sure that kind of organic development can be replicated through bureaucratic programs." Mrs. Colfax smiled, and Kate could see genuine warmth behind the professional competence. "Mrs. Chambers, I spent 10 years teaching school in Indian territory before I was appointed to this position. I understand the difference between policies that work on paper and relationships that work in practice. I'm not here to impose Washington's ideas on your community. I'm here to learn from what you've accomplished so that maybe we can help other communities find their own paths to peace." 2 hawks chose that moment to arrive, leading a group of Apache warriors who'd come to participate in the afternoon's horse training session with white and Mexican ranchers. The young war chief had grown into his leadership role with surprising grace, his natural diplomatic instincts complemented by a warrior's understanding of when to stand firm and when to compromise. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic. In the room, as Mrs. Colfax found herself face to face with an Apache leader whose intelligence and dignity challenged every stereotype she might have harbored. Mrs. Colfax Two Hawks said, his English now fluent after months of intensive practice. I am honored to meet a woman from Washington who comes to learn rather than to command. My warriors and I have heard that white leaders in the great city wish to understand how enemies can become neighbors. We are willing to share what we have learned, but we hope you understand that such knowledge cannot be written on paper and sent to other places like seeds that grow the same crop everywhere. The federal official nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the young Apache's articulation and insight. Two Hawks. I'm beginning to understand that the real secret of what you've accomplished here isn't any particular program or policy. It's the willingness of people to see past their fears and prejudices to the humanity of their neighbors. But surely there are elements of your success that could be adapted to other situations. Major Morrison stepped forward, his scarred face showing the authority that came from having proven his judgment under fire. Mrs. Colfax, if I may suggest, the key factor in everything that's happened here has been trust. Mrs. Chambers trusted an Apache scout when everyone else wanted her to fear him. Scout Elon trusted this community enough to risk his life protecting people who'd shown him nothing but hostility. Two Hawks trusted the word of enemies who'd given him no reason to believe in their honor. Without that foundation of trust, all the policies in the world won't create lasting peace. Kate watched the federal official process this information, seeing the challenge it represented to bureaucratic approaches that relied on regulations and procedures rather than human relationships. But how do you create trust between people who've been taught to hate each other? Mrs. Colfax asked. How do you overcome generations of violence and suspicion? You start with one person willing to show mercy to one enemy. Elon answered, quietly, his dark eyes finding Kate's across the room with gratitude that had only deepened over the months of their friendship. Kate Chambers didn't calculate the political implications when she pulled me back from death's door. She didn't consult policy manuals or consider how her actions might affect territorial relations. She simply saw a suffering human being and chose to help. That one act of mercy created ripples that are still spreading. Mrs. Colfax turned to study Kate with new interest, seeing not just a frontier woman who'd made an unusual choice, but a catalyst for social change whose instincts might be more valuable than all the expertise in Washington. Mrs. Chambers, the reports I've read focus on the dramatic events, the mob, the standoff, the battle with Black Wolf's war party. But what I'm seeing here suggests that the real transformation happened afterward, in the daily work of building relationships across cultural boundaries. How did you convince people to overcome their fears? Kate felt the weight of the question, understanding that her answer might influence federal policy toward hundreds of tribes and thousands of frontier communities. She looked around the classroom at children who were unconsciously creating the future, at Apache and white adults who were learning to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies, at the physical space where books and maps and medical supplies from 3 different cultures were arranged side by side like symbols of successful integration. I didn't convince anyone of anything, Kate replied slowly, choosing her words with care. I just refused to let fear make me into someone I couldn't live with being. When people saw that mercy didn't make me weak, that compassion didn't make me vulnerable, that treating Apache people as human beings didn't cost me anything, I was afraid to lose. Some of them began questioning their own assumptions. Not all of them. We still have people in this community who think I'm a traitor or a fool, but enough of them to make a difference. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the open windows as Apache, Mexican, and white youngsters played together in the yard outside, their games involving elements from all 3 cultures, blended together in ways that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Kate saw Mrs. Colfax watch them with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that the real measure of success wasn't in official reports or government statistics, but in the natural joy of children who'd never learned to hate each other Mrs. Chambers, Mrs. Colfax said finally, her voice carrying new respect and understanding. I came here expecting to find a woman who'd stumbled onto something remarkable by accident. What I'm finding instead is someone who understands instinctively what our best political minds have been struggling to comprehend, that lasting peace comes from human connections rather than legal documents, from trust earned through daily actions rather than promises made in treaty negotiations. Sheriff Bradley, who'd been listening to the conversation with the satisfaction of a man whose judgment had been vindicated by events, stepped forward with a leather folder under his arm. Mrs. Colfax, there's something else you should know about what's been accomplished here. The crime rate in this county has dropped by 70% since the Apache camp was established. Conflicts between ranchers and farmers have virtually disappeared. Trade relationships have expanded to include communities 50 miles away who've heard about what we're doing here. Whatever Mrs. Chambers and Two Hawks and Scouty Lane have created, it's not just morally right, it's practically effective. Two Hawks nodded gravely, his young face showing the wisdom that came from leading warriors who'd chosen peace over warfare. Sheriff Bradley speaks truth that our grandfathers would understand. When communities stop wasting energy on hatred and fear, they have more energy for building and growing and protecting the things that matter. Apache warriors who once spent their time raiding now spend their time teaching white children how to track and hunt. White families who once spent their resources on weapons now spend them on schools and medicine. Everyone becomes stronger when everyone works together. Mrs. Colfax spent the rest of the afternoon observing classes, watching Apache elders teach medicinal plant identification to mixed groups of students, seeing Mexican vaqueros and Apache. Warriors train horses together using techniques that combine the best of both traditions. Witnessing white women and Apache women share cooking methods that had produced new fusion dishes, unique to Mesquite Flats. By evening, when she sat down to dinner in Kate's cabin, her professional skepticism had been replaced by genuine wonder at what human beings could accomplish when they chose cooperation over conflict. Mrs. Chambers, she said, as they shared a meal that included Apache game, Mexican spices, and vegetables grown using white farming techniques, I want to offer you a position with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We need someone who understands that successful policy grows from successful relationships, someone who can help other communities find their own paths to peace. The salary would be substantial, and the opportunity to influence federal policy toward a more humane approach would be unprecedented. Kate felt Ellen's eyes on her as she considered the offer, understanding that her answer would affect not just her own future, but the future of the experiment they'd built together. The opportunity to take their lessons to a national level was tempting, but she also knew that leaving Mesquite Flats might destroy the delicate relationships that had made everything possible. Her presence here wasn't just symbolic, it was practical, daily proof that whites and Apache could work together as equals. Mrs. Colfax, Kate replied carefully, I'm honored by your offer, but I think my work here is far from finished. What we've built in Mesquite Flats is still fragile, still dependent on people who remember why we chose cooperation over conflict. If you truly want to spread these lessons to other communities, then the best thing you can do is document what we've accomplished here and help other places develop their own approaches based on the same principles of trust and mutual respect. Mrs. Colfax nodded slowly, clearly disappointed but understanding Kate's reasoning. Then will you at least agree to train other people who could serve as coordinators in similar situations? Will you help us develop guidelines that could assist communities that want to follow your example? Kate looked around the cabin that had become so much more than a home. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose mercy over revenge, hope over fear, humanity over hatred. Through the windows, she could see the lights of both the town and the Apache camp, Two communities that had learned to exist not just in peace, but in partnership. The future they were building together was still uncertain, but it was a future worth protecting and worth sharing. Yes, Kate said simply, I'll help in any way I can. But remember, what we've learned here can't be imposed from outside. It has to grow from within, from people making the same choice I made when I found a wounded stranger by my well. The choice to see a human being instead of an enemy, to offer help instead of harm, to build bridges instead of walls. That choice has to be made one person at a time, one act of mercy at a time, until it becomes the foundation for entire communities to build upon. As the evening stars appeared above the New Mexico desert, Kate Chambers sat surrounded by friends who had once been enemies, planning a future that would honor both the courage of those who'd chosen peace and the memory of those who died before peace became possible. The woman who'd been dragged from church steps for showing mercy to an Apache had become the architect of a new way of living on the frontier, proof that sometimes the most radical act in a violent world is simply the decision to remain human. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.